What was that?
What if I told you that I'd been hearing a single sound everywhere for 22 years? I've heard it in countless movies, tons of television shows, video games, and even pop music. It's a short, 3-second sound effect of something that's really quite inoffensive, but still manages to register with me every time I hear it. It's very simple, and there are a lot of sounds like it, but it cuts through the noise of anything I'm watching or listening to whenever it plays, and frankly, I've become obsessed with it. It's most often used as the effect of a futuristic lab door opening. I don't know why, but for decades it's been burrowed into my brain. This innocuous noise has been in and around practically everything I enjoy, and every time it plays, it forces 2 simple questions into my brain. How was it made, and who made it? It's been 22 years now. It's time to get those answers. It's hard to pinpoint when I first started noticing the sound effect, but as an educated guess, I want to say it was in the prominent use of Jean-Claude Van Damme's masterpiece, Universal Soldier. As a teenager, I spent a good chunk of my youth watching and then re-watching every cheesy 90s sci-fi action movie that you can imagine, and Universal Soldier was certainly in rotation. But since then, and especially since starting this journey, I've found and documented it all over the place. From Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies, to Scooby-Doo, from Tomorrowland, to The Venture Bros, from 90s children's TV shows, to a trailer for Square Enix's latest looter shooter, Outriders. The application of this simple sound effect is everywhere, and its endless uses are way beyond what any one person could track. But my journey with this sound actually started quite a bit earlier. There I was, a fresh-faced 15-year-old excited about being able to purchase my first ever 15-rated video game myself. It's not that my parents were ever particularly strict about age ratings, but the idea of being able to walk into a store and buy a game about zombies and blood myself was liberating. During my playthroughs of what I still consider to be an all-time classic, I was constantly aware of how descriptive the use of sound was. Whether that was the shambling groans of the zombies or the clickety-clack of the typewriters, the use of sound in the series as a whole is something that's stayed with me ever since. Little did I know though that one of the more passive sounds, a simple opening of a laboratory door, would be the one I'm still obsessing about over 20 years later. So what is it about this sound? Why has it become stuck in my head so firmly? Now this is an answer I've really struggled with, because I found it so hard to quantify why I find it so satisfying. Perhaps it's the almighty clunk or the winding motors that pan from left to right, but the more I dissect it, the more I believe it's the simple sound's ability to be completely diegetic, yet almost otherworldly. I've certainly never heard a door like it, but it always feels like it belongs despite the situation. Unfortunately though, tracking a sound effect's origin is not that easy. My first hurdle was simple: how do you Google a sound effect? Typing in lab door or sci-fi door understandably brings back thousands of results that could take forever to wade through, and it's not as if there's a Shazam type app for sound effects, although I really do wish there was. I was off to a bad start, so I decided to pull back and start simpler, asking a friend. My first port of call was my immediate connections in the IGN UK office, specifically my colleague Jesse, who, like me, is a huge Resident Evil fan. Although also extremely familiar with the sound, knowing how to find it was also a mystery to him. Thankfully though, Jesse had a friend called John. John is not only a huge Resident Evil fan, but has also been involved in the Resident Evil modding scene, specifically working on sound effects and voiceover. As such, he knows more than a little about the original source files. This was my guide to set me on my way, and he kindly agreed to chat to me. Obviously, we've got a mutual friend in my colleague Jesse, and he's mentioned that you've done work with Resident Evil modding in the past, is that right?
That's correct. I would do a few little mods here and there and a few little fan projects, and I'd usually tout myself as the sound designer. I say that with air quotes because I'm not a professional by any means. It's just a hobby of mine.
I've been chasing the sound from Resident Evil 2 of the lab door now for a long time, and it turns out you can't really Google what the sound effect is, so I was hoping that you might be able to help me out with this. Being familiar with the original Resident Evil sound files, John knew that a bunch of them could be sourced legally, specifically from a sound repository called Sound Dogs. What the average person might not know is that recycling sound files is and was quite common practice. It turned out Capcom had done a significant amount of this with Resident Evil, spending a fraction of the cost of original sound creation on a license instead. It's something they're less likely to do in these days, preferring to create original sounds in-house, but back in 1998 it made all the sense in the world. With this knowledge, and now a hint of my obsession, John and Jesse began combing through every potential relevant search term they could imagine. Until...
And about 30 or 40 sound effects in, I hear that sound. It doesn't take too long. You hear the door open, you hear it close, whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's it. That's the one. It has to be.
So thanks to John, Jesse, and some internet sleuthing, I now had a file and a link to a sound library. Logic would suggest that the reason I'd heard it in so many places was due to how accessible this library was to sound designers. But in my quest to find its origins, the next question was, how did it get onto this library in the first place? In an attempt to understand this procedure more, I got in touch with one of the few sound connections I have in the professional world. Someone I knew from my younger days while playing in a band. Chris Mock is a sound designer, who, since the humble beginnings of mixing my audio in local UK music venues, had gone on to do much greater things in the world of live events and television. I was hopeful that not only could Chris give me more insight, but he also might have some theories on how the sound itself was made. After giving Chris a quick rundown of my obsession and all my progress so far, and despite being slightly perplexed by the situation, he kindly agreed to help, and we dove straight into discussing sound libraries. Are there people out there that specialise in just creating them for stock libraries?
Yeah, there are both. I mean, there are people that they just record sound effects and put them onto a stock library, whether that's their own website, or they put them on places like Sound Ideas or Sound Dogs. What they might do is start with the sound effect from a stock library, but then add things. You can chop it, change it, stretch it, add to it, put reverb on it, whatever you want to do to it, really. You don't have to then say, okay, this is a scream and it has to be like that. You know, you can manipulate it like they do in films. You know, they do use sometimes stock sound effects. There are many that have, over the years, that are familiar, and sound designers try and slip them into a film. I'm sure you know which sound effect I'm talking about, but
exactly. For the uninitiated out there, Chris is referring to perhaps the most popular stock sound effect ever used in film, the Wilhelm scream, a sound effect popularised by its use in Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and pretty much every big budget action film ever since. But that's a different and well documented story. I'm here to find out about my lab door. So I decided to quiz Chris on what he thought the sound was.
First thoughts, it's a door from a sci-fi film.
Yeah.
Just one more listen. So that's definitely not, they haven't just gone, let's record this door, because a door like that, you know, wouldn't exist. So they would have had to create it. I'm going to have a listen again.
After repeated listens, it almost felt like Chris had become as enamoured with the sound as I had. Or perhaps he was just really keen to pinpoint the noise for me and make a solid prediction. But I like to imagine that it's the former.
Obviously, it is a door opening and closing.
Yeah.
But then it sounds like there's some kind of motor in there. It could be a drill. It could be a belt drive from a car that's slowed down. There's something metallic in there as well. But then that might be the door. Mm-hmm. Maybe they've added some kind of hit to it as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to listen again. God, it's so intriguing. I really want to know what it is now.
I had a link and a sound library, the original General Series 6000, which sounds more like a top-of-the-range toaster than a library of soundscapes, and suddenly, finding the effect's origins felt within grasp. After spending far longer than I'd like scrolling through the track list, I eventually found my true love, unimaginatively called Sci-Fi Door 6039_24_1. But despite the minuscule description and a note of duration, I was none the wiser to its source. So, in another moment of need, I reached out to Sound Dogs themselves, hoping that they'd guide me on my journey. I took a brief moment to enjoy this small victory. After all, I started with just a sound in my head that I was unable to Google, and now I'd managed to find the creator's name. The moment passed though, and I was quickly on to my next step of trying to track down Mike McDonough. Fortunately, this time, Google was on my side. After a quick tap and smash into the search engine, I was spoiled for information about Mike. But perhaps most notable was his very reputable work in the sound field for the last 4 decades, including big budget productions like Star Trek Insurrection and Disney's The Black Cauldron. I also found a modern video of Mike, introducing the Mike McDonough SFX collection to potential sound library customers. I now had a name and a face for the man behind the door, but I was still none the wiser with how to get in touch with him. With no apparent website or social media presence, getting in touch with Mike was proving to be tricky. At this point it honestly felt like I'd hit a dead end, and after 2 weeks of fruitless searching, I genuinely considered stopping here with just the satisfaction of finding out his name. But there it still was, an itch in my brain that I had to scratch. I decided to pick up my trail and stumbled upon an article from a Swiss website called Digitech, where in March of this year, the author had spoken to Mike about one of his signature door sounds being used in a classic video game. And no, it wasn't my Resident Evil lab doors. They'd reached out about a signature sound far more documented, the Doom doors. Yep, that's right. Not only had Mike constructed my iconic door sound, but he'd also created perhaps the most iconic door sound in video game history. A sound so widely recognised on the internet that it even earned its own moniker as the Doom doors. You can find YouTube videos montaging its uses, and it even has a page dedicated to it on TV Tropes. This article gave me enough information to help me contact Mike and prepare for our meeting, but while studying the piece, I discovered the author's journey had been eerily similar to mine. Both highlighting stock library sounds that had been used in video games, both hearing the sounds everywhere we went, and both of us motivated by childhood nostalgia, and, despite being completely different sounds, both ending up talking to the same man, Mike McDonough.
Well, my name is Mike McDonough, and I guess we're here to talk about some sounds I made.
At this point, I imagine you're as keen as I was to find out the history of this infectious sound, but the question I immediately needed an answer to was how he actually made it.
I've got to go back in my internal time machine, which isn't very good anymore. So the initial sort of click-clack sound is actually one of the very first CD players. And we were excited to get this new technology in the studio. And it was a big, heavy thing. And the little tray that comes out, it was very beefy. It was solid. It was metal. It wasn't plastic and flimsy. And it had this mechanism, this motor sound. And it went clickety-clack. And so I took it in the studio, opened the grand piano, opened the lid, and set it on the strings of the grand piano so it would resonate. So it would be louder. I wanted to magnify that sound and have it resonate on the strings. Then I just got a microphone, a Neumann U87, which is my favorite mic back then. And I got it as close as I could to the mechanism and just open and close.
An old CD player inside of a grand piano was not exactly what I was expecting, but something I did foresee was the sound being multi-layered. It turned out that the CD player was only the first of multiple elements.
And then I needed a kind of a sustained motor. And the studio had an old copy machine. Well, it was new back then. It was a big giant thing. I think it was made by Xerox. And it had multiple paper trays. So it had this stack on the side with paper in it. And when you push the button, it made this, sound, which I thought, wow, that's a great sound.
And he wasn't done there.
So a friend of mine had one of the first hatchbacks. It was a Ford Capri, it was called, and it had a hatchback and the little hydraulic lifters on it, whatever they're called. When you open it, it made this sound. So we drove that onto the stage, so it was nice and quiet, and I recorded that sound.
When it came to putting it all together, though, Mike had one final trick.
The machine I fed it from, a reel-to-reel machine, it had a wonderful little device on it that I frankly used all through the 70s and 80s, almost into the 90s to do sound design pre-digital. And it was called a VSO. And it was a little box. VSO stood for Variable Speed Oscillator. And the motor on those machines had a certain frequency they ran at. And this little, it was just a big, a dial. And when you turn the dial down, the motor of the tape machine would run slower. When you turn the dial up, it would run faster. And if you put a sound on there and went from low, slow to fast, the pitch went up or the pitch went down. So the door would sound like it's, kind of has a little Doppler effect or it was moving.
I finally had an answer which was both substantially more complex than I imagined and also slightly disappointing. Not that the ear and imagination and assembly weren't impressive, but I guess deep down part of me was unrealistically hoping for something beyond traditional means. I still had two other important questions though. When did he create this sound? And most importantly, why?
Growing up in Los Angeles, I was exposed to a lot of creative type people down there. And through a chance meeting, I got to meet science fiction author, a fantasy writer named Ray Bradbury. We became sort of friends. He was kind of a mentor of mine. And I wanted to take his stories and adapt them into, I guess you'd call them radio dramas, just for fun. So I started doing that. And when I got into university, we actually got a grant from National Public Radio to create 13 half-hour radio dramas based on Ray Bradbury's stories. So Ray was thrilled, and suddenly I had come up with 13 half-hour original radio dramas in stereo with original music and sound design. But I didn't have any sounds, really, that were professionally recorded at that time. This was in the 80s.
Right.
It was like 83, 84.
Oh,
and
that's when I was born.
Yeah, it was before anybody was watching this wasn't born. Well, I had a moment of weakness in, I guess, the late 80s. I just gotten married, and I was a college, employee, and pretty broke. Things are when you first start. In a moment of weakness and poverty, I sold a bunch of my sounds to a company called Sound Ideas. They dangled a check in front of me, and I thought, wow, someone actually wants my sounds? Someone's going to pay me money for these crazy sounds? So I sold a batch of them and became this disc called 6039 in Sound Ideas. And that was in the late 80s. And here we are talking about a sound that I made in the mid 80s and ended up in the sound effects library all these years later.
After selling all his sounds in the late 80s, Mike's library had spread far and wide. Despite not knowing about their usage in Resident Evil and Doom, he was fully aware of their proliferation in all forms of media.
For years, they've been available to the general public, and I hear them. I hear them on TV, I hear them in films, and I hear little snatches of them in all kinds of big giant budget films. And it's kind of like now I can't use them, because not everybody has access to them, and they're no longer, sort of my special little sounds that I created. So I just don't want to use the same old sounds everybody else is using, so I don't use my sounds.
There was something quite melancholic about Mike feeling like he couldn't use his own creations anymore, but there was also a clear sense of pride about his work being discussed all these years later. And perhaps more importantly, he clearly appreciated their substantial contribution to the soundscape of modern media. He'd built his legacy, but unfortunately, he was the silent partner. Despite my fascination behind the sound, Mike was very quick to normalise his work though, likening it to the disappointing reality of finding out the secrets behind a magic trick.
It's kind of anticlimactic to go into how these things were made, because there's such common sounds. A CD tray and a copy machine it's like looking behind the curtain, in the Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the curtain, and you do, and you see this guy pulling levers and kind of takes the mystique out of it,
He was right. They were common household sounds that he once assembled into something useful for a very specific moment in time. But the real magic was the journey that the sound went on, something that he could have never imagined 40 years ago, and that was satisfying despite finally knowing the secrets. His sounds have left a legacy in modern media, and that's due to not only its production quality, but also its accessibility. It's something Mike could have never foreseen or perhaps even engineered. I started this self-given quest specifically looking to get answers about how the lab door sound effect was made, and finding out was ultimately satisfying. But for me, the fascinating and crazy story of the sound's journey is the one that will likely leave the lasting memory.
Ray Bradbury's A Sound of Thunder.
Say, does this safari guarantee I come back alive?
Mr. Eccles, the only thing we guarantee is what's stated in our brochure. You name any year in the past and any animal, we'll take you there and you shoot it. It's also on the sign above your head. That's all we guarantee. But I'm sure you'll do just fine.
Look, don't you worry about me. I've been on safaris before.
Yes, I'm sure you have. And now if you'll follow me, there's someone I'd like you to meet. Step right in, Mr. Eccles.